Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. Former President of Ireland Mary Robinson speaks frankly about global leadership and campaigning for peace in the Middle East.
This is a very right-wing government and shows no signs of being willing, at the best of times, to see the need for a state of Palestine.
Also today, the campaign gets underway by the families of Troubles victims to challenge the government's new legislation, which they say denies them justice. I'll be speaking to one of the lawyers making the case in court this week. And we'll be live in London to assess if the Prime Minister's big reshuffle has hit the mark with voters. And if not, will this week's autumn statement improve anything for him? And joining me with his thoughts, the Irish News political correspondent, John Manley. It's 26 years since Mary Robinson swapped the presidential residence in Dublin's Phoenix Park for New York when she took up the role of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, a post she held for 5 years. Today, she still commands a place on the international stage through her chairmanship of the Elders, the body established by Nelson Mandela in 2007 for distinguished former statesmen and women to lobby for peace, justice and human rights. We met yesterday at the Seamus Heaney home place in Balachi to discuss a wide range of subjects from Anglo-Irish relations to political leadership and the perilous state of the Middle East. First, as a former President of Ireland, is she proud of the way in which the country's leaders have engaged with the current crisis in Israel and Gaza?
I think it's important that a country like Ireland is prepared to speak with a more moral voice, with some integrity on the issues of, the need to care about both Israeli and Palestine peoples and their concerns, but to recognise the injustice of the occupation and the long history of the problems for Palestine, while also, being very clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, that it's absolutely vital to get the hostages released. And I think there is a balance there, but there is also more of an awareness of the suffering of the Palestinian people over a long time because of the occupation.
In your role as chair of the Elders, you co-signed an open letter to President Biden in the past couple of days in which you call on him to lead international efforts to resolve the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. Are you hopeful he will take that challenge seriously?
We thought a lot about the idea of an open letter to President Biden when we had our Elders meeting recently in London. And in fact, after that meeting on the 25th of October, we issued a statement which called for a ceasefire, basically, and expressed deep concern about the horrendous acts of Hamas on the 7th of October in attacking civilians, killing them, and then taking some of them hostage, including of all ages. And then we also, called for much more restraint and a proportionate response from Israel, and we criticised in particular the siege and the cutting off of supplies, the water, oil, etc., fuel and food. And then we, as I say, called for a ceasefire. The idea of an open letter was something that we felt we had to think about as to how to frame it in terms of a longer term approach. And that was why this letter has only just emerged after a lot of thought and even a lot of consulting. There is a need for a vision of what constitutes a peaceful way forward. And ultimately it comes back to the two-state solution in some form and leadership on that in some form. So we've asked President Biden to give leadership in having that vision for peace and in building the coalition for it. That's the important thing. That coalition should consist of countries of the region, and I think a number of them do want to see a long-term solution because they fear greatly that this current crisis could escalate in the region. Secondly, the European Union should be part of that, but it must be under a leadership of the United States and centred on then new leadership on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side to be able to take this forward.
So you are absolutely clear that it would be impossible to reach some kind of agreement or settlement with the current leaderships on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side remaining in place. That's simply not a runner in your view.
Well, certainly this is a very right-wing government and shows no signs of being willing at the best of times to see the need for a state of Palestine. On the contrary, we've seen Jewish supremacy being talked about very openly. When Ban Ki-moon and myself were there in June, we were quite shocked to see how bad things were from that point of view, that there was much more settler violence, settler incursion on more and more land being taken over in the West Bank and indeed in East Jerusalem. And we saw Israelis concerned about that to the point where they said that their state was committing the crime of apartheid, which is a crime under the International Criminal Court statute. And we issued a report at that time in June saying the current situation is unsustainable. We didn't know that it was going to be so horrendously upended by Hamas in those awful attacks, but something was going to happen. It was unsustainable. We can't go back to managing that so-called status quo. We have to see a new vision for peace and American leadership of a coalition to achieve that.
And does that mean that Benjamin Netanyahu has to go as the Israeli Prime Minister? I mean, if you were sitting in a room with Mr. Netanyahu, what would you say to him?
Well, I think it's clear that he does not have the necessary vision and has shown no inclination to really take seriously a separate Palestinian state. And I think he has played Hamas against Fatah for years on this, divided them so there wouldn't be a Palestinian partner on the other side. It is true that the Palestinian Authority is not well thought of by civil society on the West Bank. When we were in Ramallah, we heard a lot of criticism of the Palestinian Authority, but it can be encouraged and persuaded to take responsibility.
And do you have particular reservations about Hamas being in government in a two-state solution because of its anti-women agenda, its anti-LGBT position? I mean, does that make you deeply uncomfortable?
Well, certainly there was a lot of evidence that before the 7th of October, Hamas, as governing Gaza, was very unpopular with a lot of the people in Gaza. Those unfortunate people who are now suffering because of what Hamas has done. At the same time, Hamas has two sides to it. It does administer the government, and it does have its brigade side, its warlike side. I'm not sure that Hamas can be totally ruled out of participation. The side of Hamas that is, has been forming administrations. It did win elections in 2006, and those elections were not recognised. That was a mistake. If they had been recognised at that time, it's possible that Hamas could have been, could have become more constitutional. That's what happens. If you allow a party that wins an election to take on a responsibility, then it can move in a direction. And unfortunately, at the moment, Hamas has moved in the other direction.
You currently chair the Elders, an organisation that offers a perspective from experienced, respected individuals who've led on the global stage. How big an issue is poor leadership in politics today, in your view?
I think we're very concerned about poor leadership and examples of poor leadership that have infected our sense of international cooperation. I'm thinking of President Trump in particular. During his time as leader, he undermined NATO, he undermined cooperation of European countries, etc. And then his failure to accept defeat has been very corrosive and very bad for leadership. we had an example in the United Kingdom of Boris Johnson, again, not taking the responsibilities of leadership in a way that was necessary during COVID, for example. And so all of this has given a sense of, worry about leadership. But we do have good examples. I mean, Poland has been able to change from a very right-wing, anti-LGBTI and anti-women's rights government to now administration of a leader who's very credible, a former President of the European Council, Prime Minister Tusk, or I think he's now taken over as Prime Minister, just about. And he will, I hope, lead a much better administration. And women fought very hard in Poland for that change.
I want to talk to you just finally about the state of Anglo-Irish relations today. I think that comes down to leadership as well, in a way, doesn't it? You broke boundaries during your time as president between 1990 and 1997 because you met Queen Elizabeth. You publicly met Gerry Adams when others would not. How important is it within the Anglo-Irish context for political leaders to stretch themselves today?
I think it's important for leaders at any point to stretch themselves, but in particular where you want to bring about peace, which was the case before the Good Friday Agreement and even after the Good Friday Agreement, and particularly after the Good Friday Agreement, it's just important to reach out to the other, to see the other's perspective and to find a way forward that can resolve whatever problems there may be. That's what leadership is about. I mean, Nelson Mandela told us, you make friends with your enemies. You reach out to your enemies with the hand of friendship, not to your friends.
Mary Robinson there, and we'll talk more about what she had to say in a moment with John Manley. But before that, this week sees the families of Troubles victims begin their campaign to challenge the government's new legislation, which they say will deny justice to them. Darragh Mackin from Phoenix Law is representing 3 victims' relatives in this test case, and he's with me now. Welcome to the programme. Broadly speaking, what argument will you be making in court?
I think Martin's starting point is when you look at it in context, what we had here was we had a system where we had criminal investigations, we had inquests, we had civil actions, we had the police ombudsman. The Legacy Act seeks to do away with all of that, and instead it seeks to channel all of the systems via the ICRIR. We say that that process in itself, the Act itself, is unlawful. It doesn't comply with the victims' human rights, nor does it comply with basic EU law, or in many ways it doesn't even comply with the basic constitutional principle that victims can access to court, access to justice.
That, of course, is a well-established set of arguments. We have the former Lord Chief Justice Sir Declan Morgan, who's leading the new body to investigate these deaths, the ICRIR, saying if the legislation is found not to be Article 2 compliant, he will consider his position. What do you make of that?
He would absolutely have to step down, I think. Sir Declan Morgan, at one stage, was obviously the Lord Chief Justice. He presided over the very inquest plan that we're talking about. He presided over the 5-year plan in which he publicly said would give victims their human rights. Now, in real terms, if it was a system whereby he was presiding over it, deemed not to be compatible with human rights, there's absolutely no way, in my view, that he could respectfully stay in that position. And I think it's a position that Declan has quite rightly accepted publicly, that he couldn't remain in place.
Do you think it's possible that the government might actually amend the faulty aspect of the legislation to avoid a potential resignation by Sir Declan?
I think there's zero chance of that. I think we have to look at what happened previously. The reality is that there were various amendments proposed. For example, the idea that the investigative aspect of the body would be in line with John Boucher's Operation Canova. That was rejected. It was proposed that the system would be amended to allow for public hearings. That was rejected. So I think it's pretty clear that the government is set on its own motivations, it's set on its own intentions, and irrespective of what Sir Declan may or may not have to do, they won't be changing their position.
I want to ask you about the views of the former Chief Human Rights Commissioner here, Bryce Dixon. He's expressed his reservations about human rights issues seeming to be placed ahead of everything else in this debate. He points out that in the past, with issues like prisoner releases, immunity from prosecution around decommissioning and the disappeared, and the on-the-run letters, human rights issues were, to a greater or lesser extent, set to one side. And just to quote him directly, he says, "The argument today comes close to saying that human rights concerns must trump everything else." He has a point, hasn't he?
No, I would say 3 things in response to that. I think one, it's more of a political statement than it is a legal one. Secondly, Bryce's statement ignores the fact that he's a minority. The European Committee of Ministers, Amnesty International, the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland and Wave Trauma Centre all say that this isn't compatible with victims' human rights. And thirdly, and most importantly, I think that almost focuses upon the principle of reconciliation. Reconciliation isn't a forced marriage. You can't force it upon people. It must be an investment from all sides. Victims and the wider public must invest in it. The reality is, as we have seen, this is unanimously rejected by all sides of the community, and therefore I think it's a slight misconception to say that somehow we should just abandon human rights in the name of reconciliation, when in circumstances in which this isn't a reconciliation process that anybody has bought into.
Yeah.
And secondly, and most importantly, I think that we must look at the fact that the European Court of Human Rights has indeed said that amnesties broadly are not compatible with the Convention or the principles of it.
Bryce Dixon, as I said, a former Chief Human Rights Commissioner and a highly regarded human rights lawyer. And what he's doing is he's looking to examples elsewhere and saying that we haven't maybe learned from other experiences, for example, of what happened on the island of Ireland 100 years ago and what happened, post-apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah, and if we look at what happened in South Africa, it was a process by which everybody invested in prior to it. I think, to quote Mayor, the namesake, the very person that Mary Robinson outlined, Nelson Mandela once said that you have to invest in the hearts and minds of the people. It's not something that can be done by a legal framework. This is a legal framework that's being invested exclusively at the hands of the British government. It is being forced upon this community, broad stroke. So what we say in response to that is that this isn't in any way comparable with South Africa. This isn't a process in which people have invested in collectively. This is a process in which has been forced upon the very people of this jurisdiction through no involvement or no input.
Okay, I want to ask you about the situation south of the border, because when this became law a couple of months ago, there was a lot of talk of the Irish government potentially taking a case against the UK government. The Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said a decision was imminent, and that was 2 months ago. Amnesty said eyes would be on the Irish government's next move after all its criticism of the legislation. And it's gone very quiet since then, hasn't it?
Well, I think just this week, the Irish government have confirmed that they've now received their legal advice and the decision is imminent. I think the reality is these processes are not straightforward. This is a highly complex piece of legislation. I think, to be fair to the Irish government, they weren't seen wanting before when the case of the hooded men had to be brought back before the European Court, and I would hope that the exact same position is adopted here. The reality is the arguments are pretty clear. As I've said, it's a majority view that this act is the greatest attack on human rights in recent history.
Yeah, but just, in a sentence, if the Dublin government doesn't move on this, what kind of message does that send out?
Well, there's a totally different consideration in play between, for example, the position that the applicants take and the one that the Irish government takes. Very, very simple and obvious example is the rights underpinned by EU law, the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework aren't in play with the Irish government. They are in play with victims on the ground here. OK, need to leave it there. Darragh Macklin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's get a word with John Manley from the Irish News, who's been listening to that conversation. Let's just start with what Darragh Macklin had to say. I mean, no surprise in the way in which he sets out his stall about what he hopes is going to happen in court, but there are all sorts of imponderables, from to what extent Bryce Dixon's view is taken on board and to what Sir Declan Morgan might do in future. How do you read it?
Well, Sir Declan Morgan made it clear to me in an interview a matter of months ago that this legislation needed to be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights and with the Good Friday Agreement. So it puts him in a difficult position as we go forward. But as he also said to me that he expected and almost welcomed the fact that this would be challenged in the court. So in some way, the legislation does need to be finessed, and the British government needs to fix the bits that aren't compatible with human rights in it. It's the whole legacy process here. I think that we've got to, as Darragh mentioned, there hasn't been buy-in from people, and that's primarily the problem. I think many victims actually welcome this shake-up and this new dynamism that it gives the process, but because there's that lack of buy-in and the motivations that prompted this in the first place, the talks of vexatious prosecutions and different things, that muddies the waters and makes people suspicious of it. OK, I want to ask you for your response to what Mary Robinson had to say about the situation in the Middle East. She didn't mince her words on a number of fronts, speaking frankly about Israel as an apartheid state and then her criticism of Hamas's horrendous acts on October the 7th. It's a difficult tightrope to walk. It's a very difficult tightrope. It's an assessment I would concur with, and I think it would. A lot of people on the island of Ireland would concur with. She it's been a commendable stance that the Dublin government has taken to resist this pro-Israeli narrative that has emerged from the European Union.
And again, on political leadership, firm criticism of the likes of Netanyahu, Hamas, Donald Trump, and Boris Johnson.
Oh, clearly, that's a low-hanging fruit in many ways to attack Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. But it shows that we maybe don't have the same calibre of leader we did 30 years ago.
OK. John, thanks for now. We'll talk to you again a bit later in the programme. Let's turn to Westminster next. The Chancellor's autumn statement is coming on Wednesday. And, of course, the sackings, resignations and reshuffles of last week remain big talking points. Henry Hill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, joins me now from our London studio. Henry, welcome to the programme. I just want to talk quickly about this, the autumn statement. A lot of talk about threatening to stop universal credit for some, to cut inheritance tax for others. What, in your view, might that be all about?
Well, the universal credit policy is essentially that if people who are on the universal credit where they need to look for work are refusing to engage with that process, they will, after a certain amount of time, essentially become disqualified from universal credit. And that's about trying to push down the welfare bill, and also the Treasury has a huge bee in its bonnet about so economically inactive people, which is people in this country who could work or able to work in theory but aren't working. Inheritance tax is a strange one. It's a very unpopular tax, despite its distributional impact. It is, I think, the second or first most unpopular tax with British voters when polled. So there is always a kind of background drumbeat amongst Conservatives to get rid of it. But ahead of a general election where the party is behind, I think they're going to want something which is going to be felt in more voters' pockets more obviously.
Yeah, and that's maybe why the front pages today are talking about a potential red wall revolt if he delivers a budget for the rich, and he might focus a bit more on tax cuts for everyone and national insurance movement.
Yeah, precisely. National insurance is one of the big ones they're talking about. Again, a few years ago, the Tories were thinking about scrapping that altogether. They called it the jobs tax. The argument is essentially that it's just a disguised way of having a higher rate of income tax. But essentially, thinking about it, the inheritance tax is deeply unpopular, even with red wall voters. This is why the Treasury keeps kind of circling around this. But if you think about the election, what you want is you want something that as many voters as possible will notice and feel, so that they have a tangible thing to be like, oh, OK, Jeremy Hunt delivered that for me when they're in the ballot box. And that's not going to be an inheritance tax cut. An inheritance tax cut, well, the only people who tangibly feel that are people who inherit in the next 12 months, and there aren't that many of them.
OK, let's talk about last week's reshuffle. Did it move the dial for the government? Did Rishi Sunak's master plan have the impact he hoped it would? The government reshuffles, we've had so many government reshuffles now that it does dilute the impact of each of them, because ministers, they need time in post to make an impact, and they very often aren't getting it. The return of David Cameron, I think, did its job of dominating the news agenda, taking some of the oxygen out of the Suella Braverman story. And it may be that over the next 12 months, some of those so-called blue wall voters, traditional Conservative voters in seats in the South and the Midlands, who've been alienated from the party since 2016, they may feel more reassured. It's probably too early to say, but I can see why that would work, potentially at the margins. Yeah, so he's trying to appeal to everybody. He's trying to appeal to the Shires and to the blue wall voters as well.
Well, the Blue Wall and the Shires are broadly the same bit of the country. The dilemma for the Prime Minister is that Boris Johnson built this enormously broad coalition in 2019, the so-called Red Wall, which are traditional Labour seats that have moved to the Tory column since Brexit, and now we have the so-called Blue Wall, traditional Tory seats, which have been alienated from the party since Brexit. And Boris Johnson didn't manage to build a substantive policy offer that could keep all those people on board. So now the Prime Minister has a very difficult decision. He's about 20 points behind in the polls. He's got limited resources. Does he focus his messaging and his resources on trying to hold those traditional southern seats, avoiding losses to the Liberal Democrats, or does he go all out to try and hold on to those Labour seats, ex-Labour seats, that Boris Johnson won in 2019?
So I suppose the question is really, Suella Braverman now on the outside, potentially making mischief for the Prime Minister, and all kinds of difficulties in his in-tray. Can this government hang on, in your view, for another 12 months?
I mean, it can hang on, right? I mean, I think the thing that it's not going to be destabilised because with the polls as bad as they are, so many Tory seats are at risk that those MPs are not going to want to eject the government earlier than they absolutely have to. I think for the same reason we're not going to see a challenge to Rishi Sunak's leadership, because who wants to seize the crown in this particular point in time? So I think it can stay in office. Whether or not it can really govern is a different question. You know, they're talking about bringing forward this new legislation on small boats. That's not going to pass. The House of Lords can block it for 13 months. So I think what we're going to get is essentially a year of spinning wheels where the best they can do is try and tee things up for what's going to be a very difficult general election campaign.
And just in a couple of sentences, if you would, Henry, are you picking up anything that suggests Rishi Sunak and his government is about to do anything about or for Northern Ireland?
I mean, I've not heard anything. The Northern Irish office doesn't really like that much at the moment, so maybe they wouldn't have told me, but no, not that I've heard.
OK, good to talk to you as ever. Henry, thank you very much indeed. Let's have a final word with John Manley, who's been listening to that. I mean, again, every time I ask a Westminster correspondent how much is Northern Ireland being discussed over there, the answer seems to be not very much indeed. Not a great sense that Northern Ireland is high up on Rishi Sunak's to-do list, but quite an interesting development over the weekend on this issue of Plan B. The Taoiseach threw in his tuppence worth at the weekend. He says, now's not the time for Plan B because a deal might yet be done. And that comes off the back 2 weeks ago of the Taoiseach saying the steam had gone out of the process. I mean, round and round we go on the merry-go-round.
Yes, round and round, it heats up, it cools down. You know, it was September, there was an expectation that, you know, things would certainly intensify if we wouldn't see a restoration of the institutions. But, you know, there just seems to be this continual drift. And, you know, your conversation with Henry there, it often feels like Jeffrey Donaldson is talking to himself sometimes.
Yeah, well, Chris Heaton-Harris said talks are in their final stages. That was during the week. But we do keep hearing these reports that Rishi Sunak is of the view that the Windsor framework deals with the issue of the Irish sea border, and he's, frankly, moving on.
Yeah, that's what you know. I've said before. It's a tightrope walk that he has to, you know, ensure he doesn't upset the EU while placating the DUP. But it's never been a public negotiation, so we get an indication of what the DUP wants.
It's interesting that Henry's saying that there's no talk about anything being done for or about Northern Ireland. There's this talk about a financial package and how this war chest that the Chancellor has amassed might be used, and we're talking about tax cuts and so forth. People here might be wondering, if he's got that money at his disposal, why might he not throw a bone in our direction? But you don't think that's about to materialise, you know, given the perilous state of public services here?
Well, I assume you mean by that as some sort of incentive to get the DUP back into government rather than just giving money without was having an administration. I think that incentive has always been on the cards, but it's until the DUP gets this nebulous legislation that it's seeking that we will get a breakthrough.
OK, need to leave it there. John, as ever, thank you very much indeed. That is it for now. You can catch this programme again in full on iPlayer, and I'll be back with The View on Thursday night at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One. Do join me for that. For now, though, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good day from all of us. Bye-bye.